Gaudeamus omnes in Domino.
I am going the way of the fathers, for I see myself being summoned by the Lord.
Sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. We're a third of the way into our consideration of the great Cappadocian fathers of the 4th century. We spent our last episode with Basil the Great, and today we turn our attention to his lifelong friend, Gregory of Nazianzus. Tradition has bestowed many laurels on Gregory. He is one of the 4 great fathers of the East, and with Basil the Great and John Chrysostom, he is one of the 3 holy hierarchs. He is numbered among the doctors of the Church. In the East, he is known as Gregory the Theologian, as if he owned the title in an almost singular way. The only other figure to share that surname is St. John the Evangelist, the author of the 4th Gospel. In the East, it is said that he is the only one of the fathers never to have spoken a word of error. Like Basil, his friend, Gregory came from a wealthy family, and like Basil, he was named after his pious and accomplished father. Gregory's dad was a convert to Christianity from Hypsistarianism. The Hypsistarians were a sect that worshipped one god, called the Most High God, and kept some of the Jewish law. They observed the Sabbath, for example, but they did not circumcise. In the year 325, the same year as the Council of Nicaea, the elder Gregory converted to Christianity through the influence of his wife Nona. 4 years later, the couple were blessed with a son, whom they named Gregory Jr., and that same year, the elder Gregory was named Bishop of Nazianzus. Again, like Basil, the young Gregory was homeschooled in his early years, tutored by gifted scholars among his close kin. He proceeded from there to local schools, and then to the regional capital of Caesarea, and finally to the great cosmopolitan cities of Alexandria and Athens. Gregory was on his way to Athens when he experienced a sudden conversion. His ship was trapped in the center of a storm and was tossed about. When the prospects of survival seemed small, he prayed to Jesus for deliverance. Like many people in a tight spot, he promised the Lord total dedication in exchange for survival. And he survived. And he made good on his promise. At Athens, he shared a household with his fellow Cappadocian, Basil, and they devoted their days to intense study, prayer, and asceticism. So brilliant was Gregory that he continued in Athens teaching after he had finished his studies. But his intention was to be a monk. He was certain that his particular vocation was to a life of quiet contemplation and prayer. He moved back home to Cappadocia in order to answer the call. His friend Basil, it seems, had turned some of his family estate into a monastery and was living there with several others. Arriving home, however, Gregory discovered that his father, the bishop, had other plans for him. His father saw that Gregory had extraordinary gifts that could be useful to the church in Nazianzus. The little town, like much of the surrounding region, was riven by religious controversies. Though most of the people favored the teaching of the Council of Nicaea, some of the most vocal proponents of the Arian heresy were very intelligent, very articulate, and also members of the elite social classes. They were influencers. Gregory's father didn't have the intellect of his son, and soon found himself helpless to respond effectively. The elder Gregory desperately needed the service of his son, but the younger Gregory wanted no part of this. All he wanted was a quiet place in which to pray with his books. And his friend Basil had established just such a place on the banks of the river Iris. Gregory's father, however, prevailed, and even pressured his son to be ordained a priest. The younger Gregory finally caved and went along with his father's plan. But almost immediately, he regretted giving consent, and he ran away again to be with Basil. For a short time, as a runaway priest, he lived the life of his dreams. With his old friend, he immersed himself in the study of the Christian classics, especially the works of Origen. Basil, however, provided no easy refuge. He believed that Gregory, now ordained, was duty-bound to return to Nazianzus and serve his bishop and his church. Gregory returned to his childhood home in great sadness. But then he went on to prove that his father's hunch had been right. With his subtle mind, young Gregory bested even the cleverest of the local Arians. He responded to them in public orations that won the confidence of the common people, and he reassured the local monks who had feared that their bishop's ineptitude was evidence of secret Arian sympathies. No father was ever prouder of his son than Gregory was of Gregory. Junior, for his part, adapted reluctantly. Meanwhile, a new problem arose. The long reign of the Emperor Constantius had come to an end. Constantius had been problematic because of his Arian sympathies, but his successor was far worse. His successor was Julian, an ex-Christian and a cultured despiser of the faith. He had, in fact, been a classmate of Gregory during school days in Athens. So Gregory knew Julian's psychology, and he found it easy to pick apart the amateur theologizing of the anti-Christian emperor. He demolished him in public addresses known as his invectives against Julian. They must have succeeded in unnerving the apostate because he vowed in a rage that he would bring his detractors to justice under the law. But Julian didn't live long enough to follow through on his threat. He was killed in battle in 363. Gregory then was free to turn his attention back to the Arian heresy, the monster that would not go away and whose theological shape kept shifting. He replicated his local success against Arianism as he started collaborating once again with his old friend Basil. In public debates, Basil and Gregory argued for the Nicene cause and roundly defeated their Arian counterparts. By their skill, Basil and Gregory achieved a kind of regional fame. When the Metropolitan Archbishop of Caesarea died, Basil was a shoo-in to be his successor, and he astounded his people in all the ways we mentioned in our last episode. But he also applied himself intensely to the necessary, though unpleasant, work of ecclesiastical politics. Basil's great problem locally was that so many of his episcopal colleagues were giving aid and comfort to heretics. His solution to that problem was to create new administrative sees, new churches under his authority, churches that he had split off from other dioceses. Once a new church had been carved out, Basil could name its first bishop, and you can bet that he looked first to his oldest and most trusted friend. He looked to Gregory. In the year 372, Basil created the Diocese of Sasima. Sasima was a no-account town with no natural resources and no refinement of character, and really, hardly any people at all. The only reason for it to become a church would be for Basil to have another ally among the bishops of Cappadocia. But for Basil, the needs of the church took precedence over all other considerations. He saw the Church of Cappadocia as a kind of chessboard, and he needed to place strong, reliable Nicene bishops in all the key positions. Churchmanship in a time of crisis required shrewd strategy, and he believed that his friends would share his sense of emergency and rise to the occasion. So Basil insisted that Gregory become Bishop of Sasima. Gregory, of course, wished to decline, stating his strong preference for thinking and writing and prayer. But Basil was persuasive, or at least he was persistent, and so he prevailed. Gregory was ordained Bishop of Sasima. In that little backwater, Gregory was miserable and lonely. Once again, as with his priestly ordination, he felt he'd been hoodwinked and used, and he blamed Basil. Gregory seized his first opportunity to make an escape. When his father fell ill back in Nazianzus, he went home, abandoning his station in Sasima. Basil tried to order him back to his see, but Gregory was having none of it. He stayed put in Nazianzus as caregiver for his dad and administrator for his dad's diocese. During those years, he wrote and delivered many of his great orations. Even when his father died, Gregory stayed put. He continued to run the local church, though he refused to be named as its bishop. Instead, he fashioned a life he found congenial. He lived in a monastery, and emerged only when absolutely necessary. In 379, he received word of the death of Basil. They had patched things up by then, but Gregory never quite recovered from the sense that Basil had betrayed him by ordaining him a bishop. Nonetheless, he wrote stunning tributes to his old friend in poetry and prose that show a keen appreciation for the man's gifts. But little did Gregory know that even on Basil's deathbed, he was still meddling in Gregory's life. Nearing his end, Basil received news that the new emperor, Theodosius, intended to place the full weight of imperial authority behind the Nicene cause. So Basil sent a letter to his allies in the imperial capital, reminding them that Gregory was the world's most articulate opponent of Arianism, and that Gregory had repeatedly proven himself effective in overcoming heresy in the territories under Basil's authority. Eventually, the day came when Gregory was summoned to the capital, and he went. He stayed at his cousin's property and converted it to a church, and because of his preaching, that church became a magnet parish for Christians faithful to Nicene orthodoxy. For this faithful remnant, Gregory became the unofficial bishop of the capital city, and he began to do for Constantinople what he had done previously for Nazianzus and Caesarea. He won a hearing from people, and he made a strong case for Nicene orthodoxy. Naturally, this infuriated the old guard Arians, who were anxious about their position under the new emperor. So on Easter Vigil, the heretics sent a mob to disrupt Gregory's liturgy. They beat Gregory, though he was able to escape. Another bishop in attendance was not so lucky, and he was killed by the Arians. But the incident only served to increase Gregory's stature in the capital city. And when the Emperor Theodosius arrived in 380, he named Gregory as bishop, and he expelled all other claimants to the office. The following year, he summoned the bishops of the world to a council at Constantinople. The emperor's motive was to unify the church and settle, once and for all, the lingering doctrinal disputes regarding the Trinity of the Godhead and the person of Jesus Christ. Our man from Nazianzus presided at the council, which was extremely contentious. A large number of bishops even contested Gregory's right to be there, and he didn't have the will to fight them. So he resigned his office in the midst of the church's Second Ecumenical Council, and he went home to his family's estate. And in the end, he got his wish. He returned to the contemplative life he had only been able to taste in the years of his youth. For the next 6 years, he wrote poetry, and he left a voluminous body of poems of the highest quality. The great scholar Peter Gilbert has done us the service of translating many of Gregory's poems and publishing them with St. Vladimir's Seminary Press. Listen to one of his several poems on the fragility of human nature. Dear world, though not so very dear, why like a rolling wheel do you bear down on me, who trudge, wheezing, like a tiny ant distressed at his sore burden? But you who are so huge, on the other hand, bear so much. I know, in fact, that you are from God, proclaiming him. But likewise, formed by Christ's own hand, You were woven of things both heavenly and earthly. The body was fashioned down here, while soul again is a breath of the great mind. Nevertheless, like all the others, I am driven to and fro by my miseries, miseries from an enemy. And like a sea-going dolphin upon land, in the thin air I die. World, my time is done. Bring the people on unwounded. Gregory died in 390, and presumably was then utterly free from the influence of strong personalities. He could finally rest in peace. In our next episode, we'll be back in Cappadocia to visit with Gregory of Nyssa and Macrina the Younger, both of whom were siblings of Basil the Great and friends of Gregory of Nazianzus. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please consider making a contribution for the continuation of our series. The Way of the Fathers is listener-funded, so we're dependent on the generosity of people like you. Please pay us a visit at catholicculture.org/donate/audio and leave us a note if you love the Fathers. We pray for our benefactors every day.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by catholicculture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. It's a film club devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture Podcast.